Hello all, and welcome to this webinar. So let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Shri Ranjani. I was a master's student at the Center of Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and I've recently just graduated just a couple of months back. And yeah, a very good evening to all, and a very good morning to Professor Rahnev. And thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, so I welcome you all to the webinar on the computation and neural basis of visual metacognition by Dr. Dobromir Rahnev as part of the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences seminar series. Dr. Rahnev received his PhD in psychology from Columbia University in 2012. After completing a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship at UC Berkeley, he joined Georgia Tech in 2015. His research focuses on perceptual decision making, the process of internally representing the available sensory information and making sense of it. Dr. Rahnev uses a wide variety of methods such as fMRI, TMS, simultaneous TMS fMRI, psychophysics, and computational modeling for his research. His work appears in high-impact journals such as Behavioral and Brain Sciences, PNAS, Nature Communications, and Nature Human Behavior. He has received over $3 million in funding, including PI grants from NIH, NSF, and the Office of Naval Research. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today, and we look forward to your talk. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Ranjani. That's really nice of you. Let me share my slides. All right, you can see it well? Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Wonderful. So as Ranjani was saying, I study perceptual decision making in my lab. And as just a very quick introduction to perceptual decision making, you can think of perceptual decision making in the simplest form as sort of this very simplified process. There's a stimulus somewhere in the environment. And that stimulus gives rise to an internal representation, an internal sensory representation of some sort. So based on that internal sensory representation, then you make a decision about what is out there in the environment. This decision can be very automatic and unconscious, or it can be very much modulated by conscious process. And then after you make a decision, you can also engage in a process of evaluation. So you can say, how, for example, how confident are you that this decision is correct or incorrect? So this process of perceptual decision making, every component is very important, and honestly, you can't study any of them in isolation. In order to understand evaluation decision, you need to understand the internal representation, and in order to study the internal representation, the only way you have is by studying the decision and the evaluation. So in my lab, we study all of these different parts, but for today's talk, I'll focus just on this last part, the evaluation part. And when you talk about evaluation, we usually talk about metacognition. So it is this higher order ability that we humans have to evaluate the likely accuracy of our own decisions, to evaluate how much we know, to sort of have knowledge about our knowledge. So as I see it, there's several main challenges in studying metacognitive evaluation. And I'll just highlight the 3 main ones that I have identified. So one is how to measure it. How do you measure your one's metacognitive ability? The other is how do you model it? So how do you model the sort of this process of metacognitive evaluation that people engage in? And the third one is how do you, finding out the neural correlates. How does the brain do it? So there's a lot of research on each one of these 3 things. We have at least half a dozen measures of metacognition. We have at least a dozen models of metacognition, and we have many dozens of papers on the neural correlates of metacognition. And yet, there's something that is very critical that is missing, which is the links between these. So a measure of metacognition should be very strongly linked to a model of metacognition. It's sort of a conceptual point that is oftentimes missed in the field. if you have a measure of metacognition, no matter what it is, it automatically carries with itself an assumption about an underlying model. That assumption may be really complicated to figure out, and that model could be, really difficult to write down explicitly, but there's always an assumed model. In the same way, when you have a model, there's an assumed measure of metacognition that goes with it automatically. But for most models and for most measures, deriving the other part is actually really difficult, so people don't do it. And we end up with measures that are completely divorced of models and models that are completely divorced of measures. Similarly, there's a very strong link between models of the brain. So if you have a model of how metacognition is given, then that has implications about how the brain does it. And if you know something about how the brain does it, that has implications for the models of metacognition. And yet, again, the link here is very much mostly ignored, and we tend to study these things independently. So my research, part of what we have been trying to do is to link these three things together. So here's the brief outline of what I'm going to tell you today. We'll start with a new model of metacognition. So we're going to develop and test a new model. Then we're going to link it to a measure. So we're going to use this model to derive a measure of metacognition, and we're going to examine some of its properties. And finally, we're going to take this same underlying model and we're going to link it to neural mechanisms that we observe in the brain. All right, so let's start with the first part, developing and testing a model of metacognition. So the first step, if you want to develop a model of anything really, is to ask, what is the target effect that I want to model? What is it that I'm trying to achieve with this model? And there can be a lot of answers for anything, and including for metacognition. But I think what is the most important part that is critical to model is this basic fact that metacognition is imperfect. So what do I mean by metacognition is imperfect? I mean something pretty specific. So we can use signal detection theory, and if you're not familiar with that, you don't really need to know the details at this point. But from signal detection theory, we can derive this measure of stimulus sensitivity called D prime. And this is just how good you are at a task. It's related to accuracy, but just a better measure than accuracy because it's derived from an underlying model. So we can do that. We can compute D prime. And about 10 years ago, Manus Kalko and Lau developed a measure of metacognitive sensitivity. So this is not stimulus sensitivity, this is metacognitive sensitivity called meta D prime. So it's very much related to D prime. It is the sensitivity computed from the confidence ratings, not from the choice data. So not from the primary decisions, but from the confidence. And the good thing about meta D prime is that it's in the same units as D prime. So then you can compare the two of them. And the way people compare them is by taking a ratio, meta D prime divided by D prime. This ratio we call M ratio. And if this M ratio, which is meta D prime divided by D prime, is 1, then metacognition carries the same information. The confidence ratings carry the same information as the primary decision. But what we often observe is that it is less than 1. So this is sort of an empirical result that shows up again and again. And that suggests that metacognition is imperfect, or metacognition is also inefficient. This measure M ratio, we call it a measure of metacognitive efficiency because it measures the metacognitive ability independent of the primary task ability. All right, so how do we model this imperfect metacognition? There's one pretty obvious answer, and this is something that has been in the literature for a while, which is that you can model it using metacognitive noise. And metacognitive noise is just noise that affects the confidence ratings, but not the decision. So how does that work in practice? So here's a bit of a modeling part. So if you have a two-choice task where people need to discriminate between two stimulus categories, S1 and S2, usually in my lab we use very simple stimuli like a left-tilted Gabor patch and a right-tilted Gabor patch, but you can use really anything. You can think of these at the stimulus level; they're perfectly separated. They're two different types of stimuli that are perfectly separable. Now, this is at the stimulus level. Now, when you present it to the subjects, there's noise in the visual cortex, in the visual system. So we can model this noise as sensory noise, Gaussian sensory noise. And then what that gives us at the decision level is not stick functions anymore, but Gaussian distributions for S1 and for S2. And the internal representation at the decision level, we can call it our sense for response. The sensory response is a normal distribution with given means, mu1 and mu2, and the variance is the sensory noise. This actually, if you know segmentation theory, this is actually standard segmentation theory. So this is sort of the canonical, two Gaussian distributions with a criterion that separates them. All right, so far this is just, as I said, standard segmentation theory. Now, if we have to add metacognitive noise, we would postulate one more layer of noise. So before you give confidence ratings, there would be additional metacognitive noise. So that's sigma meta. And then what that means is that at the decision level, let me try to move that a little bit. Okay. So at the meta level, apologies, you have the same Gaussian distributions, they just have a larger variability. So the means are the same. So the internal representation at the meta level is normal distributions with the same mean, but with larger variance. The variance is the sum of the sensory variance and the metacognitive variance. Now you can think of this picture as so in this depiction, the metacognitive noise is added to the signal itself. So at the meta level, we just have noisy signal. But another way of thinking about this is that the metacognitive noise is added to the criteria. What does that mean? So again, we can have our standard picture from the first depiction, the stimulus level, the decision level, except that now we won't have a metacognitive level, except instead we're going to put the confidence criteria on the decision level, but the criteria themselves would not be stable like they're here, but they would themselves come from a distribution. And if that distribution is a normal distribution with metacognitive noise, with the same metacognitive noise as here, then these models are actually completely equivalent. In fact, I would talk about the model this way because it's more intuitive, but I actually believe that this model is, or this depiction of the model, they're mathematically equivalent, is more proper. So it's not that there's a different level of signal altogether, but there's a the criteria themselves for confidence are noisy. So okay, so we have this really pretty simple model. If you don't know segmentation theory, this may look a little bit complicated, but it's just one step removed from the basic model of perception, which is segmentation theory. So can this model lead to any kind of prediction? Turns out it does lead to a prediction, and actually a pretty interesting counterintuitive prediction. So within this model, we can compute d prime as the difference between the two means, the mu2 minus mu1, divided by the sensory noise. And this is just the standard formula for d prime. And then melody prime would be the same thing, but computed here. So mu1 minus mu2, they're the same mu1 and mu2, except that the standard deviation here is given by this expression. So when you divide these two, melody prime divided by d prime, the numerators are going to cancel out, and you get this expression. And the important part about this expression is that it's an increasing function of the sensory noise. So as the sensory noise increases, the numerator increases faster than the denominator. And I have plotted here for some values of sigma meta. So when there's no sigma meta, when that's 0, then you just get 1. But for positive values of metacognitive noise, then you have these increasing functions. So that leads to this relatively counterintuitive prediction, which is decreasing the sensory noise would decrease metacognitive efficiency. So decreasing the sensory noise is a good thing. We have less noise in our system. So, you may automatically think that it would make your metacognition better, but here the prediction is that it would decrease metacognitive efficiency M ratio. Right, so how do we go about it to test this kind of a model? We need a way to manipulate sensory noise. So that actually turns out to be a much more difficult thing than it sounds. You can't just add noise to the stimulus because that would actually affect not the sensory noise but the sensory signal, and it's actually a pretty tricky thing to deal with. But here's what we thought would be a good option. So conceptually, high noise is the same as more variability in the internal signal. So when I'm talking about noise here, I really mean noise within the signal detection framework. So high variability within signal detection framework means that each trial is relatively dissimilar from the rest of it. And on the other hand, low noise means that the trials are more similar. So the internal representation for the different trials are more similar to each other. So then within this reasoning, we can think that we can use perceptual learning to decrease the noise, with the idea being that perceptual learning makes you more stable over time. So as you really learn the task over a long period of time, you see the stimuli with less noise. The internal representations become more similar to each other. So this is what we did. We had 7 days of training on a simple perceptual task. I'm not going to show you the exact task because it doesn't really matter. We're training people on a 2-choice Gabor patch task, and this was led by my former postdoc Jiwan Bang. All right, so what do we find? So over the 7 days, we can measure the threshold stimulus intensity, and that goes down. So that means that people need lower stimulus intensity. This is sort of like contrast, but we did a slightly different manipulation, but you can think of this as contrast. So people need lower and lower contrast to reach the same performance level. So people are getting better, which is exactly what you expect on perceptual learning. You can measure D prime. D prime goes up. So again, this is exactly what you expect from perceptual learning. People get better on the task. And you can look also at confidence. As people become better, they also become more confident. So that's also expected. So that's great. And now the critical question is, what happens to metacognitive efficiency? Again, we predicted that as we decrease the sensory noise, we'll see a decrease in metacognitive efficiency. So even though D prime goes up, confidence goes up, we expect M ratio to go down, and it's exactly what we see. So this was a very surprising finding when we saw it. We're training people over time, and it looks like their metacognitive efficiency is actually getting worse. But it turns out it's actually predicted by this simple model of metacognition. Now, this is one manipulation. We tried a few other things. And I'll just show you one more thing we tried, which is ultra-fast learning. So the question here is, do the same effects appear on the order of minutes rather than days? So usually perceptual learning is done in this lake. you take one person and you train them over many days, which is what we did in the previous experiment. But we asked, can we do it differently? So here's the idea. If you have a large number of subjects, here we had 178, and each subject does a bunch of trials. In this case, let's say 97. The way you usually analyze that data is you look at each subject, and for each subject, you compute D prime, you can compute M ratio, you can compute whatever you want to compute, right? This is what I call standard subject-based analysis. And usually this is just called analysis because this is what we normally do. Now, the way I show this, hopefully you can already guess what is coming. So we could actually analyze the things differently. We can just take trial one and do the same kind of analysis across all the subjects. You need, a good number of subjects for that, but you can just compute D prime for trial one, D prime for trial two, as well as M ratio and anything else. So I call this trial-based analysis. So this is what we're going to do here. So we have two different tasks in this study. One was a detection-based task where each trial started with a fixation, then a stimulus appears, and this stimulus is pretty hard to see, but it's a Gabor patch that is oriented either 45 degrees counterclockwise or 45 degrees clockwise. In this case, I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually this orientation, a left tilt. So people need to say what is to choose left or right, and then give a confidence rating. In a second task, it was the timing was the same, everything was the same, except that it was what we call the discrimination-based task. So the Gabor patch was a full contrast, so you can see it very clearly, but the orientation was very, very close to vertical. It was less than 1 degree tilted either to the left or to the right. And again, this is probably very hard. If you win the experiment, you can learn it over time, but this is a very slight left tilt off of vertical. So left is the correct answer for this particular trial. And as I already mentioned, we have 178 subjects, 97 trials per subject. We used Amazon Mechanical Turk for data collection. All right, so what did we find? We found that over the course of the 97 trials, people get better, which is, just again, standard perceptual learning, just on a very fast scale. But importantly, even though people get better, so this is D prime, M ratio goes down. So again, as the sensory noise decreases over the course of perceptual learning, metacognitive efficiency goes down. And these effects are very highly significant. So this for the detection task. For the discrimination task, we actually had both effects still held, but they were much smaller. Still significant, but much smaller effects. But importantly, both effects went down at the same time. So there's actually a significant difference in the slope between the D prime slopes in the two tasks. So the learning was smaller in the discrimination task, and this is actually very important. Because the learning was smaller, the decrease in sensory noise was lower. Also, the decrease in metacognitive efficiency was also smaller. So we think that this is really good support for the predictions of this model and a validation of the model that we have. All right, so this is what I want to say about the model. So now that we have developed and tested the model of metacognition, we want to think about deriving a measure of metacognition out of this model. By the way, I'm happy to take questions as we go along if you have any, or take them at the end. But because this is the end of one section, maybe this is a good time if there's any burning questions. All right, so let's try to derive a model of metacognition out of this. Let's try to derive a measure of metacognition out of this model. So what do you want from a measure of metacognition? Again, there's a couple of things that we really want, which is independence from nuisance variables. And when I say nuisance variables, I mostly have in mind two different things. One is the confidence criterion location. So the confidence criterion location determines how confident you are. So are you overconfident or are you underconfident? And we want our measure of metacognition to be independent of that, because we want your overall confidence to be independent of your metacognition. So if you're an overconfident person, we don't want to measure just trivially high metacognition for you or low metacognition for you, right? We want whether you're underconfident, low or overconfident. This is nothing to do with your metacognitive ability per se. This is just your bias. So we want to separate that bias from the sensitivity. We also want to have a measure that is independent from the accuracy of the task. So if you have just high accuracy, so let's say you're in an easy condition, we should not measure high metacognition or good metacognition in that easy condition and bad metacognition in the difficult condition, which is actually what happens for the majority of measures of metacognition. So to develop a measure, we create this task where people give confidence on a continuous scale from 50% to 100%, and they moved a mouse cursor. We had 3 different contrast levels, 20 subjects, but a ton of trials per subject. So each subject completed 2,800 trials over 3 different sessions. And this is work of my now former graduate, Metha Shekhar. She is off to a postdoc at UCL now. So here's the idea behind the analysis. So we wanted to check specifically the confidence criterion location. So if you're placing a criterion here or here or here or here, then what kind of metacognition are we measuring? So so this is the scale that people had, and in the analysis we would binarize the scale into just we've recoded into just low confidence of 1 and high confidence of 2. So if we put the confidence thresholds here at 55, you have a very small area of low confidence, very large area of high confidence. Then we would move the criteria and we would recode it this way. We would move them again and would move them all the way to the end. And for each of these placement of the confidence criteria, we would compute M ratio based on this recoded confidence. And importantly, I mentioned this already, this condition here corresponds to the highest confidence. So when the criteria are really close to 50-50, you give high confidence all the time. When the criteria are all the way on the sides, you give high confidence very rarely. So this is the lowest confidence. All right, so that's the analysis idea. So what did we find? We found that the existing measures vary with these nuisance variables. So we looked at first M ratio, which is meta d prime divided by d prime. And I'm showing you the results for each of the 3 contrasts. Contrast 1 is the lowest contrast, contrast 3 is the highest contrast. And the 3 contrasts are on top of each other, which is good. So this measure meta d prime divided by d prime M ratio is independent of the difficulty of the task, but it's very much dependent on the confidence criterion location. So as you use higher criterion, which means that this corresponds to low confidence, you also have low measured metacognitive ability. So so low confidence automatically leads to low metacognition when you use this measure, which is not what we want. We can also, and these are all very significant. We can also compute meta d prime, which is just this measure, but without dividing by d prime. And you see this, the exact same downward trends, they're all significant. But in addition, you also have this very unwanted effect, which is that there's a big difference in estimated metacognitive ability for the different contrasts. So for the easy contrast, you have high meta D prime. For the lowest contrast, you have low meta D prime. So your estimated metacognitive ability depends on the difficulty of the task. And I'm only showing you these two measures in the paper. We looked at a bunch of different measures. They all show this this effect, and it's really just this new measure, M ratio, that is independent at least of the difficulty of the task. But as we're seeing here, it is not independent of the metacognitive bias for high or low confidence. All right, so now that we have this decrease, what do we do about it? How do we model it? And we thought about a really simple model that can explain it. So we first started with the standard signalization theory model, which is, we have these Gaussian distributions, and you have really just complete stable confidence criteria. So there's no metacognitive noise in this model. This is just the standard signalization theory. We also tested the model that I presented you before, which is metacognitive noise has this Gaussian distribution. And this is what people have always done, just use a Gaussian distribution. The issue is the variability of all of the criteria are the same, so you're not quite going to get the same this decrease in metacognitive ability for different confidence criteria locations. So we decided that we can test a log normal metacognitive noise. And a good property of the log normal distribution is that its variance increases with the mean. So the far away confidence criteria are actually noisier than the ones that are closer to the decision criterion. There's also the really good property that the log normal distribution stops at 0. So the confidence criteria never go on the other side of the decision criterion, which is what happens with this model, which is sort of a weird, nonsensical thing. All right, so we took these three models, we feed them to the data, and then we compared them. We use a Kaike information criterion, or AIC. And for AIC, a difference of more than 10 indicates substantial support for one model over the other. So this is the results that we found when we compare the log normal meta noise to the standard signalization theory without any meta noise. We see a very large support for the log normal metacognitive noise model, and we can quantify this even more precisely. And this kind of quantification tells us that this log normal meta noise model is 300,000 times more likely than the standard signalization theory. So this is expected. We are comparing existence of metacognitive noise versus no metacognitive noise. When we compared the log normal meta noise model to the Gaussian meta noise model, we found very similar results, a slightly weaker effect, but still quite strong. And this is the log normal meta noise model is 620 times more likely than the Gaussian meta noise model. So good. This log normal metacognitive noise model provides better fit to the data, but they can't capture the same effects that we find. So again, here are the data that we observed that I showed you earlier, and here are the model predictions. So standard signalization theory without any metacognitive noise just says M ratio is always going to stay at 1, and it's clearly not what's happening. So it can't really capture the data. The Gaussian meta noise model actually shows this weird behavior where it actually goes up. So it's a qualitatively wrong prediction compared to the data, and it's only the log normal meta noise model that shows a at least a qualitatively similar effect. The shape looks slightly different from the data, but there's no at least significant difference between these shapes of the fit and the data. Okay, so great. We have this new model of metacognition, the log-normal meta-noise model. So now the critical thing that we want to do all along is test whether we can derive a new measure of metacognition based on this model. So the obvious measure that we can derive is just metacognitive noise. So this parameter, which we call sigma meta in the model, can be used as our measure of metacognitive noise. Our measure of metacognition. So first we can do this for the Gaussian meta-noise model. And if we just look at this sigma meta parameter, the metacognitive noise parameter, we again see that it's independent of contrast. So that's great. That's similar to M ratio, but it increases for the high confidence criteria location. So so that's not a behavior that we want. And sort of this increase is significant. For contrast, that is not significant, but yeah, we still have a measure that is not independent of confidence bias. But when we do this for the log-normal meta-noise model, now we have a measure that is not significantly modulated by either confidence criterion location or by contrast. And these are frequency statistics. We've also done Bayesian model, Bayesian comparisons, and there's actually significant or substantial support for the null hypothesis that there is no modulation of confidence criterion location. So what that means is we have now derived a measure of metacognition which is independent of both the difficulty of the task as well as from the confidence bias. And this measure sigma meta derived from the log-normal meta-noise model. And this is the first measure in the literature that can do that. All right, great. So we talked about a model of metacognition and we derived a measure of from that model. Now let's go to the last part where we are going to link this model to the neural mechanisms. So many brain regions are involved in metacognition. I will focus here on two very important prefrontal sites, DLPFC and aPFC. DLPFC stands for dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and previous literature has shown that it tracks, its activity tracks the confidence level. aPFC stands for anterior prefrontal cortex, and it has been linked specifically to metacognitive ability by many previous studies. So the question here is, how do we connect the model and the neural substrate? So again, here's the model. I'm going to revert back to the simpler model with Gaussian metacognitive noise, but it's exactly the same thing if you use log-normal metacognitive noise. And here these two regions of the brain, DLPFC and aPFC. This is where the sensory signal is in the back of the brain. And we would suggest this simple model where DLPFC reads the sensory signal and relays it to aPFC or sends it to aPFC. And aPFC makes the final confidence judgment. So based on the previous literature, this seems to be a reasonable description of at least a very high level description of what DLPFC and aPFC do for visual metacognitive tasks. So how do we go about and test this? We reason that, so here's again the model, the raw sensory signal goes to DLPFC, which extracts the sensory signal strength, sends it to aPFC, and aPFC makes the final confidence judgment. So we reason that we can use TMS to test this. So if we to send TMS to DLPFC, what should happen is that the sensory signal strength is decreased, and that would lead to a confidence change. So it looks like there's less signal strength, so there should be a change in confidence. Versus if with TMS-aPFC, then the sensory signal strength would still be the same, so there wouldn't be a confidence change, but your metacognitive judgment is going to be the more noisy or less noisy, so there will be a metacognition change. So that's the prediction. Here's the design that we used. We gave fixation for 500 milliseconds. Then there was a very brief stimulus for 100 milliseconds. Then people gave a response that took up to about a second. So we were thinking, like, when should we send the TMS? When is the confidence computation actually happening? And we reasoned that, based on some prior literature, it should really be happening in this range around here. So we chose to give TMS. We chose to give 3 TMS pulses on each trial, one at 250, 350, and 450 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. We TMSed either aPFC, DLPFC, and use S1, the primary somatosensory cortex, as a control site. So for each subject, one block of trials we would TMS aPFC, another block of trials we would TMS DLPFC, another block of trials we would TMS S1, and we would use the counterbalance order for that. So what do we find? We find a dissociation between DLPFC and aPFC in terms of our results. So when we look at confidence, we see exactly what we expected, which is that DLPFC TMS decreases confidence compared to the control condition. So this is our baseline condition. So sending TMS to DLPFC results in lower confidence. But for aPFC, that's not the case. There's no difference between S1 and aPFC. Versus when we look at M ratio, in this case, delta M ratio, we see that there's an effect for aPFC such that aPFC results in a larger, better metacognitive performance compared to either the control site or DLPFC. So these results provide support for our hypothesis, but we wanted to see whether the model can really show them, like whether the model can really reproduce the same kind of results. So within this model, we tried to mimic the results by mimicking the effects of TMS. So we reasoned that DLPFC TMS should decrease the readout strength. So the way we model that is by making the readout decrease by this parameter. And aPFC TMS should decrease the metacognitive noise. So we have this parameter delta sigma meta, which is the decrease in metacognitive noise. So here's again the data that we observed, and here's the model simulations when we do that, and you can see that we find the exact same qualitative effects with the data and the model, which suggests that these regions really could be having these functions that correspond to the model. So quick conclusions. We developed a new model called the log normal meta noise model, which makes new predictions, and we validate those predictions in data. We use that model to derive a new measure of metacognitive ability, which is just the metacognitive noise. And we saw that this measure has a much better psychometric properties. It is independent of these nuisance parameters It is independent of the confidence bias, and it's independent of the accuracy on the task, exactly the way we want it to be. And we could do that because we derived the measure from a model rather than just come up with a measure out of thin air. And finally, we also linked the log meta-noise model to the neural correlates and suggested that the role of DLPFC is to read out the sensory signal and pass it to aPFC, which computes the confidence. So, next steps that we're working on is to determine the sources of metacognitive corruption. We have a recent TICS article on some speculations that we have on, what are the sources of metacognitive inefficiency. And this is an active area of research in the lab. So I want to thank the lab members, especially Jiwan Bang and Meha Shekhar, who were involved in this research, a number of collaborators, as well as our funding agencies, NIH and ONR, who support this research. And thank you so much for your attention. Happy to take questions.